At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too.
Introduce our keynote conversation speakers. I'll ask them to join me here. Julie Ormond and Charity Wallace are joining us today. We're starting high. we're headed to the literally to the stars, and we're so excited that these two individuals could join us today. Julie Ormond is an actress and the founder and president of ASSET campaign that stands for Alliance to Stop Slavery and End Trafficking. And Charity Wallace is the founder and principal of Wallace Global Impact.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this very important topic, something I feel very strongly about. It's fun, like Dr. Benton said, for me to be back on campus. I serve on the advisory board for the public policy school, but I graduated from Seaver, and one of my favorite professors is here, Dan Caldwell. He, at Pepperdine, actually I was thinking about it, I was coming onto campus and about what our conversation is going to be about. When I was young, my father was on the board of Pepperdine, and I got to go with them. They took a trip, and Dr. Benton was on the trip. And we went to some of the international programs. And one of the things that we got to see was the Berlin Wall. And it just come down, but we actually stayed in East Berlin and traveled through Checkpoint Charlie every day to get to West Berlin and chiseled at the wall. And I remember seeing a story of a young man who had died 6 months before the wall came down, trying to escape. And it hit me as a young girl, just the cost of freedom, and how I took it so much for granted living in the United States. And that sort of started me on a trajectory of international relations, and Dr. Caldwell's classes helped solidify that, and I had the great opportunity to travel to more than 70 countries with Laura Bush and really see how women impact transformational change in communities and countries. And all of this prepared me to be fighting for freedom, and that's why we're here today, because that's something that Julia feels very strongly about as well. And I'll say, I've had the privilege of meeting with incredible people over the last, too many years, 15 years. But Julia stands out to me as someone who has incredible passion, incredible knowledge. She's one of the most impressive women that I've come in contact with. And so I'm just thrilled to have this conversation today to talk about the importance of women in policy and politics and how women can use their voices in all different ways to influence that. But before I started, I thought we would, so I'm gonna get to the conversation with Julia, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the reason why women should be involved and some of the statistics that we've seen. So we sort of intuitively know that women have incredible influence in communities, and they always have, but now there's been a great amount of data and research that's been gathered. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of a background on that, and then we'll start into the conversation, which will lead us into that. So we know from data, research, and experience that women are catalysts of change all over the world, from the bush in Africa to women leaders like Margaret Thatcher. So to set the stage, I thought we could just talk a little bit about it. So research confirms that gender equality and inclusion have an enormous impact on the stability, prosperity, and peace of a country, and then honestly on the world. So the best predictor, there's research that shows, I'm quoting this, the best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how its women are treated. However, many women in the world still lack basic needs: education, healthcare, safety, economic opportunity, and clean water. Studies show that when women are included in the economies, countries are more stable and prosperous. Women reinvest 90% of their earnings back into their families and their communities, compared to men who reinvest 30 to 40%. Sorry, guys. ASSET's approach is to work to create a market economy that ends enslavement. It was the source, co-sponsor, and convener of the Global Transparency in Supply Chains Act, which is called TISC, which was passed in 2010 in California by Governor Schwarzenegger and authored by Senator Darrell Steinberg. The TISC Act California came into effect in 2012, and Asset went on to collaborate with UK charity Unseen to upgrade and include TISC in the UK Modern Day Slavery Act that passed in 2015. So it's a global movement that Julie has started and champions. And you've been actively involved for more than 20 years. And it's incredible that you're using your platform and your voice not only to really shine a light and spotlight the issues, but to champion legislation, which I want to talk about, and serve as an advocate and ambassador to combat labor trafficking in the supply chain and other ways. And we've had the opportunity to talk a little bit over the last maybe 6 months about all that you're doing. And I'm just so inspired by your passion and really the impact that you've had. So why don't you help us set the stage, tell the story of Asset, why you got involved.
Thank you. Let's turn it on.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not on, but it's really low. I got it.
Yeah,
It is now. Thank you for that. Thank you, Reese. I just wanted to bring it right back to real to say that it's always a bit daunting as somebody who doesn't have a degree to come into a sphere where people are so educated, you know, even as we fight for women's rights, girls' education, boys' education as well, and all of these things. Just wanted to bring it right back to real that I feel beautifully at home because I also love creme brulee. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for setting the stage and all of the things that you said. Yes, I think I've forgotten the specifics of the question already.
Just tell us about the story of Asset.
The story
why
of
you got
Asset.
involved.
So, for me, as somebody, as I became an actor, as I became a celebrity, you get given these opportunities to take the spotlight and bounce it off onto something else, which I think initially I maybe even just was doing because it made me uncomfortable. So it was much easier to say, let's look at this instead. But I did start to go on a life that was these incredible opportunities of, would you like to come to Sarajevo and see the School for the Blind that was the sort of standing point for the Serbs and help us raise money to rebuild that. And I got to go on witness trips. And so what started as these little spots of engagement on a volunteer basis started to feel like the most satisfying moments of my life. And the most meaningful and the most anchoring. And the moments in my life where when things were going on in the world that were disturbing or anxiety provoking, I actually felt that I didn't feel as disempowered because I felt like you could develop a sense of agency. And I then went on, I definitely had a turning point in my career where I felt a little bit disillusioned, and I joined forces with a producer to create Film Aid International. She was the founder, I was founding chair, one of the earliest people in. And Film Aid International takes films to refugee camps to do all sorts of social programs to raise awareness. And for me, it was socially impactful storytelling. And then, as you can see, this was all somewhat bitty and piecey, and I think that's very, very much how a lot of us ramp on to something that could grow, that can grow. I participated in Film Aid International, took a great deal of energy and effort to raise the resources for 1 year's budget for one impactful program in two or three refugee camps. But I was also involved in a documentary called Calling the Ghosts that was about rape, war, and women who had survived a Serbian camp, and we screened it at the Council of Foreign Relations. And at that screening, a human rights lawyer stood up. We had brought the women out from Prijedor to talk also with Richard Holbrooke, who was the mastermind and the force behind the Dayton Peace Accord. And we brought them together through the telling of this film. And And the human rights lawyer said, I would like to do something, is there anything that we can do together? And together over the next year, through sharing the story, through sharing testimony and information, they developed a piece of legislation that piggybacked on something else. It was the legislation that President Bush then utilized to have the Serbs hand over Milosevic to The Hague. So I was very kind of on the sidelines and piggybacking really on other people's journey. So, but I worked on primarily, I guess, HIV/AIDS, conflict resolution, and refugees. And at each point, this issue of trafficking and slavery would surface. And it would surface as the sentinel issue for all of the others. It went laterally across all of these silos, and it undermined every single agenda. So, and if you were a refugee, for instance, they couldn't do refugee. The UN was offered huge resources by Microsoft to do refugee reunification, and they couldn't do it. And the reason was we don't have sufficient protections that this hardware and software could actually, should it fall into the hands of the Albanian mafia, it means all of the refugee children, all of these people are now vulnerable because somebody has their access to their information, and we don't know how to separate the two. And our legal obligation is to protect people, so it's it's safer for them to stay apart. And one of the most tormenting things for refugees is they have no idea whether or not their child, their husband, their father is safe, alive, or anything. If you work on HIV/AIDS, there's no way that you can complete that agenda without taking on sex trafficking and victims of sex trafficking and their agency and whether or not they can, for instance, just use a condom and just keep themselves safe and keep society safe. If you work in the environment, deforestation is one of the biggest issues, and that's forced and driven by forced labor. If you're concerned about food security globally, I think seafood is off the menu by 2048. And it's almost something that you kick out there as a statistic and you think, okay. And I think it's taken me a very long time for my brain to actually say, I'm actually understanding what you're telling me. You are telling me that seafood, let me run that by you again, is off the menu, will not be available by 2048. And there are something like 3 billion people who rely globally on seafood as their primary protein. Once that goes, the whole ecosystem is dramatically damaged, changed, perhaps irrevocably. So when I was asked by the UN to become a UN Goodwill Ambassador, I actually said no way. I actually said no way because I just I felt, at that time I couldn't see any solutions, and I thought, this is just dark, dark stuff. This is government responsibility, it's police enforcement. I don't know, I can't see solutions in that. And I was told by Milan Verveer, get over yourself. Get over yourself and get out there and go look for solutions. Don't turn this down before you go look. So I started a journey, assisted by the UN, to go and look, and I made a specific point of saying to them, I'm probably not the right person to just be asking for checks for an issue. I really want to get into the solutions. I want to see talk to all the stakeholders and move the needle. And that took me around the world, to Russia, to Ghana, to Cambodia, Thailand, India. But I didn't actually have to step out of Los Angeles. The first people that I met were actually right here in LA. And it reframed my sense of my own freedom. Because everywhere I went, I would come across children, men and women, who were not just coming out of brothels or coming out of instances of domestic servitude, but children who were put at enormous risk, some of whom, I think particularly with Lake Volta, the child slavery and fishing in Lake Volta have been discovered because of the numbers of children's bodies that were washing up on the shore. And the children that we went to see, we described the fact that when they'd been forced to dive into this lake to catch the fish that was big as their arm span, under these dark waters, they would have to find the eye sockets of the fish and squeeze them so the fish would calm. And the trick was to get that right and not catch because your fingers could get caught in the gills, and the fish would overpower you and you drown. And that was how they'd watched their friends drown. And the local estimate was some 80,000 children trapped on these islands by traffickers. And that was the first trip. And as I worked with the NGO, I said, where does the fish end up? Where's the fish that they are forced to catch, sold? And they kind of went quiet. And when you couldn't find out. I couldn't find out whether I, as a European, had brought this fish on the European market. Had I bought it, paid for it? Had I fed it to my child? Was I actually that disconnected from the work practices around the world and what was going on? And then it turns up in carpets, it turns up in pet food, it turns up in ocean fish, it turns up in mining, and I would literally come home from these trips and walk through the door of my house where I felt secure and free previously, and everything felt tainted. And so the journey of Asset, a long introduction to get there, the journey of Asset was, I realized that I as an individual couldn't just hunker down and actually change anything. I might be able to just buy a fair trade product, but what I really wanted to do was change the system or do what I could to change. I didn't actually, in all honesty and in all candor, I didn't actually believe I could change the system. All I wanted was to know that I was doing what I could. And I guess the biggest thing that I would say is that's enough. It's once you know, it's not okay to do nothing. And what you do, you just have to keep going. So I set up Asset, and our primary focus was to engage companies to look at the issue. Every door was shut in their face. So we realized pretty quickly, I hired somebody super smart, Alison Friedman, and she we discussed legislation early on. I was like, there's only two of us. So, and there's no public awareness. And she said, but it's the right way to go. And we both said, yeah, okay. So that was how we came across. We saw the legislative piece as the essential catalyst through transparency, through companies telling us what their policies were and what they were doing throughout their product supply chain globally. We saw that as the thing that would yield evaluation so that we could take that information to the consumer and take an incredibly complicated issue and simplify it so that I can just go, what do I buy? I'm really busy. What do I buy?
So you've talked about, we have talked about this, about being a conscientious consumer and an informed consumer. Because to your point, it's, just as you've laid out, it feels very overwhelming. The issue feels extraordinarily overwhelming, and it's like, what do I do? I mean, as an individual, you feel sort of that you can't make an impact. But to your point, that's how you started, and then you realized that one step at a time that you could make an impact. So I want to ask you two questions. One is, what can all of us do to make an impact, to address this very overwhelming issue in the world? And then the other thing that I think you said that was interesting is that you went and did a lot of different kinds of outreach. So you worked with HIV, you worked with obviously slavery issues, you worked with all different kinds of issues. And I know for myself, and this is something I talk to women about a lot, because people say, like, where should I start? And some of it is you have to get out there and know what's your own passion, because each one of us sort of has something that really ignites us. And that's what you want to give your time to. So in asking you this question, what can each one of us do? What's your advice with regards to how each one in this room can have transformational change with just one person doing it?
I think for me the biggest thing is to not let your self-doubt be an out. Don't let lack of faith in yourself be something that stops you from engaging. I talked a little bit about the screening at the Council of Foreign Relations, and somebody who was there was Richard Holbrooke, and something like 2 days later, there was a phone call saying, at my office, saying Richard Holbrooke would like to take you for lunch. And at first I was kind of like, what? Like, how did he get my number? And my staff were like, we're in the phone book. Okay. And I turned up, I was somewhat scared because at this screening that we'd had at the Council of Foreign Relations, I was swimming in doubt. And part of it was, I can't remember the names of the guys. It's like Radovan, Karadzic. There was all of these names that were unfamiliar, and that was enough to have me say, you know what, I'm just gonna not say anything because I can't remember the names. So that's the first thing, don't accept that in yourself. I was lucky enough to have an assistant who said, you're an actress, learn them. Okay. Surround yourself with people who will push back at your own moments of inadequacy. And at the screening, the producers and director and the women were saying, go and ask Richard Holbrooke why he's not arresting the indicted war criminals. And I was like, I can't remember the names. And they said, no, go, that's not enough. It's Radovan Karadzic, it's Slobodan Milosevic. Got him down now. Go and ask him. So I sidled up and I said, please, could you tell me why we're not arresting the indicted war criminals? And he was a very tall man. He turned and he looked at me and he said, because we don't want another Somalia. And I said, oh, okay. I walked away. And then as a group, we were kind of debating amongst ourselves, well, it's not Somalia and it's not this and that. And he called and asked me to come to lunch. And I sat down and he'd started eating. I sat down and he said, that was lame. And I said, what? He said, that was really lame. He said, I can't do my job if you don't do yours. If you accept that answer, I cannot go higher up and say people aren't accepting that as an answer. And he rather wonderfully kind of took me under, but he also said, why is it that you responded to this European war? Where were you for Rwanda? And I had no answer for that, really. I had watched things happen with Rwanda. I'd been horrified by it. I hadn't felt empowered to really do anything. But when former Yugoslavia fell apart, on the press was regular updates through the BBC that said 2 hours from London. And it was just unfathomable. And it was just something you engaged in because it was your community. And I think starting there, Holbrooke said, you need to go to Human Rights Watch, you need to bone up on issue, and come back and tell me why that's not an adequate answer from me. And that was one of the greatest lessons I learned, that it's okay. It's okay to start with, I care about this issue, what are you doing? And that essentially was what the policy was, the Transparency and Supply Chains Law. So I'm not a supply chain expert, I'm not a procurement expert. You're a corporate. You need to create your own policy that is relevant to your own supply chain behavior. And then I would like to be able to evaluate that so that I can make an informed decision as a consumer.
Talk more about the legislation piece of it, because that is a challenging piece. So that is the policy piece where you have to go to lawmakers, convince them, first of all, write the legislation, and then convince them to pass the legislation, advocate for it. So when we're thinking about, just as individuals, is there anything that we can do to help push legislation? So yeah, you have the issue, but talk a little bit about that experience.
So once we had decided that it was what we were going to do, what we did feel was that we had sufficient relationships to reach out and that we had an urgent enough issue that was an imperative for us to take on. So we found people in Sacramento. I had a terrific board. Al Meyerhoff was one of my founding board members. We reached out with all the political capital that we had to go to Sacramento and took it to Darrell Steinberg, who is the president pro tempore of the Democrats. And you do have to connect with a politician who's going to have enough spine and enough commitment to see it through whatever happens. And we were very lucky in finding that with ours. So it really just started with stories that I've just sat here and told you. And it's quite surprising to me when I look back that it is as simple as start telling the human story. Start framing it as an imperative and start telling the human story. And then together you unpack what the potential is of where you can go on this journey together. So we were very lucky in Darrell. We also reached out because even though we were a tiny organization, a little bit of seed grant money from Humanity United, we were part of a coalition, so you're part of another group. We did a lot of inquiry. We did as much inquiry as we could to other people in terms of what would this look like if corporate engaged. And it was actually Darrell who was author of the bill. We supported his staff in coming together with writing the bill. And I think for me, the most important thing was that the legislation was real. I think from most of us, but particularly, I didn't want to be passing a law that was hypothetical. I didn't want to be, it had to be a law that could move the needle, and it had to be something that was undeniable for corporate to take on. So the framework of the Transparency in Supply Chains Law is that it requires the major manufacturers and retailers of California, and that's those who trade over 100 million globally, but who register at all with the Franchise Tax Board in California. It requires them to tell us their policy, to disclose their policy to eradicate trafficking and slavery throughout their product supply chain. It applies to manufacturers and retailers. Slightly sneaky, because you can't actually just go in and find people enslaved or in forced labor. You actually have to have a proactive, positive human rights agenda that's a mix of access to human rights. It's in the global north, most articulated through the union voice, whatever our relationship to the union or that. It's essentially dignified work. So using enslavement and eradication of enslavement as the end game globally, it's a vehicle to drive human rights into the workplace globally and give access to workers. But we, most critically, we didn't let business have an out, and not a single business in California supported this piece of legislation. Other than the businesses, the finance sector, there were people from the social responsible investment community who rallied globally. There was something like 32 global social responsible investments companies representing something like 40 million. And as this legislation has gone global and gone to the UK, it's now $1 trillion in assets under management that's behind it. But we did have panels where you go through a series of panels, series of testimonies to get the votes to move forward. And every time companies said, but this isn't real and we can't do this, politicians were able to say, they're not asking you to do anything. You are legally compliant with this piece of legislation if you do nothing. You just have to say, we do nothing. If you don't think you can do anything on this issue, you don't have to do anything on this issue. But you are legally required to make that public. And that was the game changer, because at the time, even the best companies that were doing the best work repeatedly would tell us, we cannot step out and talk about how we effectively stopped beating our wife. Because people say, so you were beating your wife. So the people who were introducing and pushing forward best practices couldn't actually monetize that. They couldn't turn that into something that was a brand positive.
I want to pause for 1 second just to talk a little bit about, Julie has this amazing platform. She's used this amazing platform. And I wanted to tell just a personal story about how I got into what I was doing. Because I actually also feel like I have this amazing platform that I feel like God has opened the doors for me to do. But I have to say, I walked into then Governor Bush's campaign as a volunteer, not knowing the Bushes at all. So my whole point is, and this is the reason I'm telling the story,
each one of us, it can feel overwhelming, is my point. And I feel like sometimes you think, well, I don't have this platform. I don't have this ability to call a senator or Richard Holbrooke. But so what happened with me is I walked in off the street, I started as a volunteer, my parents afforded me the opportunity to do that as a full-time job. I never thought the Bushes would know my name. I ended up working very hard and many long hours, and then going on the campaign, being hired at the White House, which I thought I would be there a year to have this great experience, and then come back home to California. September 11th happened, which sort of changed my trajectory. I was there on that day, and it was very scary, but it also solidified to me that I wanted to be there for a purpose, and I knew that I could be there for a purpose. And so as the years progressed, I got more and more incredible experiences, but my whole point is I walked in off the street because I felt passionate about something, and I wanted to be a part of it. And I really wanted to work for Condoleezza Rice and learn from her. And that is the reason I started. And I honestly never thought that, 16 years later, I would be very close to these incredibly influential people, but also incredible people who are compassionate. And one of the things that I know that you had an experience with President Bush and sort of confronted him at the White House. But one of the things that we did a lot in the Bush administration and continues is public-private partnerships, which are really influential in moving the needle on specific issues. So whether it be the AIDS platform that was developed in 2002, which has saved millions of people's lives all over the world through PEPFAR and continues today. It was very important that corporations, so we need people in business that can transform policy. So there are women leaders in business that need to be there because corporations are a huge part of what you're doing and the things that I'm doing for women all over the world, but also then policymakers and politicians. It's important for women to be in these leadership positions because they approach problems differently. We tend to work more collaboratively together. And there was a story that I met with this African member of parliament she was one of the only women in parliament, and she said that there was legislation that was on the table in her country, and it was for the benefit of the community. So it was about water and roads, and none of the men would vote. It was very tribal the way that they were voting. And so she kept thinking, we have to get this done for our community. And so what she did was she invited all the women spouses of her colleagues for breakfast. And she talked to them about the legislation that their husbands were about to vote on and the reason why it was really critical for them to pass this. And of course, all of the women went home and talked to their husbands, and the thing passed. And it was for the betterment of their community. But my point is, each one of us can walk in off the street or use the platform the passion, the purpose that we all have. And it can be from someone who was a volunteer, who never thought someone would ever know their name, but just believed in the issue, to someone who has an incredible platform and uses it so incredibly well. And I have such great respect and admiration for you that you do that.
Well, you too. I want to talk a little bit, because this is a good example you brought up there. That as an actor, you get invited to things like the Kennedy Center honors or whatever, and that would be my go-to meet the president moment. But I was working on Calling the Ghosts, I think, when I had the opportunity of lining up to meet President Clinton, and I was overwhelmed by that moment that when it got to actually meeting him, I talked about the shrimp. I talked about not forced labor in shrimp, but I talked about, oh my goodness, you must be so tired, standing here, how do you do it? Receive all these people, I've been enjoying the shrimp in the buffet, and then we were moved on. And I looked back and there was a woman talking policy with him. And I was like, what an idiot. That was my tiny window. That was it. So then later, as you mentioned, got invited to the White House because the Bush presidency was screening a movie that I had done, and it was one of their first, it was the first screening actually that they had at the White House. And So I'm not going to do that again. So I really boned up on issue. I remember just sort of making sure that I had all my facts straight. And then we're in the corridor outside after the screening. President Bush is talking to a few people. And I find myself having a conversation with Laura Bush, who at some point says, "Stop, you're talking to the wrong person. He's over there." I was like, "Okay." But every step of the way you're confronting fear. Every step of the way it's like, I'm gonna mess this up. I'm not gonna represent this properly. There's all sorts of, I don't think it's just me because I hear it too consistently in terms of the female realm of insecurity. Am I gonna get it right? Am I the right person to do this? And at some point you have to say to yourself, why not me? And not let that be the out. So, completely terrified, I go up and I'm sort of hovering like an adolescent on the edge of the conversation. And eventually he very politely turns to me and he says, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I hope you'll excuse me, I'm not going to waste any seconds on small talk. I really came here because I would like to talk about refugees. And I know that I'm likely, if I'm lucky, I'll get 2 minutes of your time." And he went, looked at his watch and said, 2, go. And let me talk. And it was one of the most generous, I did actually, he let me talk for about 10 minutes, but we covered a lot of ground. And then he very quickly said to his chief of staff, about 30 seconds in, "Will you set up a meeting so that we can do a proper follow-up?" And that was all I needed. That was it. And so easily I could have had yet another conversation about shrimp. I want to circle back to what you were saying about what is it that each of us can do. The other thing that I think that I have had to learn is a lot of patience in terms of how long this is actually going to take. And I think something that has also been a real grow-up moment is accepting incremental change. It feels like a huge task to take on legislation. It feels like, and because it's such a huge task, I know from a movement perspective, there's great disappointment and dissatisfaction with a piece of legislation that effectively was step one. We wanted to break denial. We wanted to give a legal structure for the companies doing the right thing to step out and talk about the existence of forced labor in the supply chain, which has now happened pretty much in every sector. And I think that has been the great impact of the law. But because it was such a huge lift, and because it was a crazy risk, you couldn't get funding, or we got very little funding, and because it was a huge task, everybody wanted it to be the full picture. They wanted this to be a piece of legislation that delivered full corporate accountability all the way through to certification. And that turned the law into something that was that was unrealistic. The only thing that you could do as the first step and the foot in the door was tell us what you're doing. So the first stage was policy. Now, this was a law that came into effect in 2012. It immediately got picked up and mirrored in the UK, and we worked underground, under the radar, collaboratively with Unseen UK, who were the central organization, and we did the brain dump on this worked, this didn't, this was missed, we'd like this. But now that there's this piece coming in, the next bit can grow. We're now at a point where we have evaluation. At the time of, the month before the passage of the bill, we had a consumer interface platform. We had a website where, as a consumer, you could click on a brand name, you could suggest a brand name, you say, I buy this, you click on the brand, it would generate a letter on your behalf to the company that said, we want to know what you do around these criteria. And all it said was, care about the issue, please could you tell us what you do on these criteria, which are the ILO recommendations, and then we would log the response. We generated, with that collaboration, we generated 67,000 emails that went to 780 brands, and we got 58 responses. 58 responses from 67,000 emails is a degree to which corporate owned the narrative. They did not have to tell us anything. They could say, we don't have this issue in our supply chain, or we're doing something, but we don't have to tell you what it is. Today we have, through California, an evaluation that evaluates just under 2,000 companies, and it's a legally defined level playing field. It is not just an assessment of the good actors in the space, it's an assessment of everyone. So within that, you have people who are literally doing nothing. I think every time you have a conversation with someone who's doing nothing and they are seeing other people do something, it makes them think. And thinking about it is the first step. Awareness raising is another piece of it. Writing policy and articulating what is it you are going to do. Do something. What is it you're going to do? And how do you shape that policy? You reach out to other people. In corporate policy, you reach out to other people. So somebody described it very, the next step is moving from descriptive to prescriptive. It's moving from policy to actual best practices. Transparency enables us, it's a window, it's a key to the toolbox. There are lots of tools that can be used to end enslavement and spread human rights. Transparency is the key to opening that toolbox. It's a window into practices, because we can't just walk onto factories, mines and farms and find people their private property. Once you have that, you can measure best practices. As soon as we can start measuring best practices, we can give that information to the consumer. We're trying to spread that information onto tech platforms and tech interfaces, so that I, as a mom, can go in and potentially look something. Do I buy this brand or that brand? What is it that through my tiny choices every day, instead of changing my entire life, can I make tiny choices every day that make a difference and feel better about it?
And I think that's part of what we've talked about, how every single person can do, instead of doing 100%, everyone can do something that then does actually have this ripple effect.
I think it's taking, I feel very blessed that through whatever dint of luck or hard work and luck, yes, but hard work and luck, I got to go on a journey that was extraordinary, and I got to get into rooms where somebody like Richard Holbrooke was there. And I think for me, part of the legislation and design of it is that you find that way that everybody can engage through the first simple step. And then as you have that experience and it feels good, and you know that it's making a difference, you're also encouraging companies to do better. And that is precisely what we are now seeing.
Right, and sharing best practices with companies,
Yeah.
so that they can then adopt those best practices and informing them. I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A.
Oh.
Is that okay?
I'll play Oprah. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes.